For centuries, we've been taught to look for power in the obvious places. Crowns, thrones, armies, flags raised over conquered land. But one of the most powerful forces in medieval Europe had none of those things. No king, no capital, no standing army, no single ruler issuing commands. And yet, it shaped prices, dictated access to markets, punished kings, and decided which cities prospered and which withered. Its influence stretched from London to Novgorod, from the North Sea deep into the Baltic. It wasn't an empire, it was a network. A cartel of merchants who figured out something most rulers didn't yet understand. If you control trade, you don't need to control territory. Power will come to you anyway. Welcome to The Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. To understand how the Hanseatic League came into existence, you have to strip away the romantic image of medieval Europe. This was not a continent of stable kingdoms and orderly markets. It was fragmented, violent, and unreliable. After the collapse of Roman authority, Northern Europe became a patchwork of weak states, competing princes, city lords, and feudal claims layered on top of one another. Borders shifted constantly. Laws changed the moment you crossed a river. Justice depended on who controlled the road you were standing on. For merchants, this wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Trade existed, but it came at a brutal cost. Ships faced piracy in the North Sea and the Baltic. Caravans were subject to tolls, confiscation, or outright robbery. A merchant could load a ship with grain or timber and lose everything before reaching the next port, not because demand wasn't there, but because protection wasn't. Kings were happy to tax trade when it passed through their lands, but far less interested in guaranteeing its safety once it moved beyond their reach. Contracts meant little across borders. If a deal went wrong in a foreign city, there was often no court willing or able to enforce it, and yet the profits were too large to ignore. Northern Europe was rich in exactly the resources the rest of the continent needed. Timber for ships and cities, grain to feed growing populations, furs, amber, fish, salt, wool. Demand was rising, cities were growing, and trade routes were forming, whether rulers liked it or not. The problem wasn't demand, the problem was trust. Trust between strangers, trust across languages, laws, and loyalties. And trust in this world was in short supply. Merchants were left with a choice: accept permanent vulnerability or build their own system of protection. The earliest seeds of the Hanseatic League weren't ideological or political, they were practical. In the 12th century, merchants from cities like Lübeck and Hamburg began cooperating informally. They shared ships for safety, they traveled in convoys, they warned each other about hostile ports, corrupt officials, and dangerous waters. What began as mutual aid quickly evolved into something more strategic. Cooperation reduced risk. Reduced risk meant lower costs. Lower costs meant higher profits. And once merchants realized that collaboration paid better than competition, the logic became difficult to ignore. Over time, these relationships hardened. Cities that hosted and protected merchants gained access to goods, capital, and connections. Cities that didn't found themselves bypassed. Trade routes didn't just reflect geography, they reflected trust. And trust began to cluster around specific ports and towns. Lübeck, sitting at a crucial crossroads between the Baltic and inland Europe, became one of the earliest hubs. Hamburg linked river trade to the North Sea. These cities weren't powerful because they had armies. They were powerful because they were unavoidable. What's important to understand here is that no one sat down and designed the Hanseatic League. There was no founding charter, no declaration, no moment where someone announced the creation of a new power bloc. It emerged the way markets often do. Organically, driven by incentives, merchants aligned their behavior because it made economic sense. Cities supported them because trade brought wealth. Over time, alignment turned into expectation. Expectation turned into rules, and rules turned into leverage. As these merchant networks expanded, something subtle but critical happened. Trade stopped being just an economic activity and started becoming an organizing principle. If enough merchants refused to trade with a city, that city suffered. Prices rose, supplies dried up, revenue collapsed. Cooperation wasn't enforced with violence, at least not at first. It was enforced through exclusion. And exclusion in a world dependent on trade was devastating. This was the quiet genius of what would become the Hanseatic League. It didn't try to replace states, it worked around them. It didn't overthrow rulers, it made them dependent. Kings might control land, but merchants controlled access. And access to grain, timber, salt, and credit mattered more than banners flying over castles. Slowly, almost invisibly, economic coordination began to outweigh political authority. By the 13th century, these merchant alliances spanned dozens of cities across Northern Europe. They spoke different languages. They answered to different rulers. But when it came to trade, they increasingly acted as one, not because they were ordered to, but because the system rewarded those who complied and punished those who didn't. This was the birth of a new kind of power, one that didn't need legitimacy from God or lineage, one that didn't rely on conquest, a power rooted in logistics, trust, and collective enforcement. The Hanseatic League wasn't yet a cartel in the modern sense, but the foundations were already there. Shared interests, shared rules, shared consequences. And as this network grew denser and more confident, it began to realize something even more unsettling. If merchants could protect themselves, coordinate trade, and enforce standards across borders, what exactly did they still need kings for? As the network expanded, its power became harder to ignore, and impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Merchants weren't just cooperating anymore, they were coordinating. They began standardizing contracts, weights, measures, and trading practices across cities that technically had nothing in common politically. A deal struck in Bruges could be understood in Bremen. Prices quoted in Riga made sense in Cologne. This wasn't cultural harmony, it was economic alignment. And alignment reduced friction in ways medieval states simply couldn't match. The League's merchants also began to institutionalize their presence abroad. In key foreign cities, they established trading enclaves known as contors, semi-autonomous commercial districts that operated under Hanseatic rules rather than local ones. London had the Steelyard. Bruges and later Antwerp hosted major Hanseatic communities. Novgorod became a crucial eastern node. These weren't embassies in the formal sense, but they served a similar function. They housed merchants, stored goods, resolved disputes internally, and negotiated collectively with local authorities. If a foreign ruler wanted access to Hanseatic trade, they dealt with the group, not individuals. That distinction mattered, because once negotiations were collective, leverage shifted. A single merchant could be coerced, taxed, or ignored. A coordinated network controlling essential trade flows could not. When disputes arose, the League responded not with petitions, but with pressure. If a city mistreated Hanseatic merchants or violated agreed terms, the response was swift and impersonal. Trade stopped. Ships were rerouted. Goods disappeared. The economic pain was immediate and unmistakable. This was economic warfare, but without bloodshed. At least most of the time, the brilliance of the Hanseatic system lay in how little it relied on force. Violence was expensive. Armies required funding, loyalty, and constant maintenance. The League preferred something cleaner: denial, exclusion, boycotts. These tools didn't require soldiers. They required discipline, and discipline was enforced not by ideology, but by profit. Cities that broke ranks lost access to the network. Merchants who violated rules found themselves isolated. Compliance wasn't moral, it was rational. Over time, rulers learned the lesson the hard way. Kings might grant privileges, exemptions, or protections to Hanseatic merchants, not out of generosity, but necessity. Northern Europe depended on the flow of goods the League controlled. Grain shortages could destabilize cities, timber shortages could halt shipbuilding, salt shortages could cripple food preservation. The League sat at the choke points of all three. When conflicts arose, rulers often discovered that sovereignty meant very little if markets turned against them. This didn't mean the Hanseatic League was universally loved. Far from it. Local merchants resented its dominance. Rulers bristled at its autonomy. Cities excluded from the network accused it of monopolistic behavior, which, in fairness, wasn't entirely wrong. The League fixed prices, restricted access, coordinated supply. By any modern definition, it behaved like a cartel. The difference was that there was no regulatory authority strong enough to stop it. And here's the uncomfortable part. The League didn't become powerful because it was corrupt or conspiratorial. It became powerful because it solved a problem no one else could. In a world without reliable states, it provided reliability. In a world without enforceable law, it enforced norms. In a world without security guarantees, it reduced risk. People didn't submit to the Hanseatic system because they were forced to. They participated because the alternative was worse. This is where the story begins to move beyond medieval trade and into something far more familiar. The Hanseatic League wasn't just moving goods. It was organizing expectations. It was shaping behavior. It was deciding who got access to markets and on what terms. And once an institution controls access, it doesn't need a crown to rule. By the 14th century, the League had grown confident enough to act openly as a political force. When Danish kings threatened Hanseatic interests in the Baltic, the League didn't appeal to higher authority. It raised fleets, it blockaded ports, and negotiated treaties on equal footing with monarchs. The war against King Valdemar IV of Denmark ended not with his victory, but with concessions to the League. Trade privileges were secured, autonomy was preserved, a loose coalition of merchants had bent a crown to its will. Nothing says limited power like forcing a king to renegotiate. And yet, even at its height, the Hanseatic League never became a state. It had no capital, no permanent treasury, no unified military command. Its meetings were irregular. Attendance was voluntary. Decisions were often slow and contentious. On paper, it looked fragile. In practice, it endured for centuries. Because its strength didn't come from centralization, it came from alignment. The League was held together by a shared understanding. Protect the system, and the system will protect you. That understanding proved more durable than loyalty to any single ruler. Cities rose and fell, dynasties collapsed, borders shifted, the League adapted, it rerouted trade, shifted hubs, absorbed shocks. It behaved less like a government and more like a market organism, responsive, pragmatic, and ruthlessly focused on survival. But this adaptability carried a hidden cost. As the League grew more entrenched, it also grew more conservative. Rules that once enabled growth began to resist change. New competitors emerged. Southern trade routes expanded. Atlantic commerce began to eclipse the Baltic. States started centralizing power, building navies, enforcing laws, and issuing credit on a scale merchants could no longer outmaneuver indefinitely. The very governments the League had once outperformed began catching up. The Hanseatic League didn't collapse in a dramatic moment. It faded, slowly, quietly, as incentives shifted, as alternatives emerged, as the balance between state power and market power recalibrated. But the lesson it leaves behind is sharper than ever. You don't need sovereignty to wield power. You need coordination. You don't need armies if you control access. And you don't need ideology when incentives do the work for you. The Hanseatic League didn't rule Northern Europe by decree, it ruled it by necessity. And that is often the most durable form of control there is. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.